So, warm welcome to the Faculty of Law at Lund University and the mock trial against Stig Engström for the murder of Prime Minister Olof Palme. My name is Christian Dahlman. I'm a professor of jurisprudence. I'm the director of the mock trial project, and I will be the host and moderator of today's proceedings. The murder of Olof Palme was a horrific and pivotal event in Swedish history, and I assume that most of you sitting in the audience knows the details and the circumstances of the crime very well, but I'm nevertheless going to give you some brief background facts. Olof Palme was assassinated on the 28th of February 1986 in central Stockholm. He was walking home after a night at the cinema, accompanied by his wife, Lisbeth Palme. They had no bodyguards. He was shot at the corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan in central Stockholm. In the map, the route that they took from the cinema is indicated with the red dotted line. Palme was shot in the back at close range and died immediately. The assassin also fired a shot at Lisbeth Palme that missed, barely grazing her back. The ammunition used was .357 caliber ammunition, typically used with a Magnum revolver manufactured by Smith & Wesson. According to eyewitnesses, the assassin fled the scene running down Tunnelgatan, a side street, a dark alley indicated with the yellow dotted line on the map. Tunnelgatan was a poorly lit alley, and at the time of the murder, there were porta cabins for construction workers standing in the middle of the alley. The police investigation into the murder of Olof Palme is one of the largest and longest police investigations in Swedish and world history. And it has been criticized for a number of fundamental errors. One of these errors occurred a week after the assassination at a press conference where the police showed a picture of what they believed the murder looked like. The picture is known as the phantom image of the assassin. It looks like a blurred passport photo, but it's actually an artificially created image. It's a facial composite based on the testimony of a woman who contacted the police and said that she had observed a suspicious-looking man in the vicinity of the crime scene around the time of the murder. The man in question was later completely written off as a suspect. The police pursued various leads, and in 1988, their main suspect was Christer Pettersson. Pettersson was a drug addict with a long criminal record that included manslaughter. And he was identified by Lisbeth Palme in a police lineup. He is number 7 in the lineup. In 1989, Pettersson was prosecuted and brought to trial for the murder, and he was convicted by the Stockholm Municipal Court, basing their verdict on Lisbeth Palme's identification. But the verdict was appealed, and the appeals court acquitted Pettersson. The appeals court was less impressed by Mrs. Palme's testimony, referring in their verdict to an expert opinion by a witness psychologist who pointed out that Lisbeth Palme's memory could have been influenced by later information, among other things, the phantom image that I just showed you of the shooter that does resemble Christer Pettersson. The police investigation continued for many years, but no one except Christer Pettersson has ever been prosecuted or brought to trial for the murder. In 2020, the investigation was officially closed down, 34 years after the assassination. The head of the police investigation at that time, Christer Pettersson, held a press conference where he presented Stig Engström as the main suspect and probable assassin. Pettersson said that since Stig Engström was no longer alive, he could not be brought to justice, and that the case was therefore officially closed. At this press conference, Christer Pettersson presented his evidence, and it sounded very much like a prosecutor's closing argument at a criminal trial. In contrast to a real trial, there was no one at the press conference speaking in Stig Engström's defense, and the evidence presented by Pettersson was not assessed by any judge or jury. From a legal point of view, it was like a three-legged chair where two legs were missing. At today's mock trial, all those three legs will be represented. You will hear legal experts speaking for the prosecution and the defense, and you will hear a panel of judges assess the evidence. A mock trial is a simulation of a real trial. But the panel of judges will assess the evidence just as they would have in a real trial, using the same methods that they would use in a real case. In some mock trials of historic events, there are actors playing the roles of defendant or witnesses, but that will not be the case here in today's proceedings. No actor will play the role of Stig Engström, and we will have no actors playing the roles of witnesses. What you will soon hear from the prosecution and defense is a presentation of the main evidence and the main arguments. For practical reasons, it will not be possible this morning to go over all the evidence, all the particular circumstances, all the arguments. What you will hear is a summation from each side of the main arguments from each side. But the verdict that you will hear will be based on all the evidence. For the purpose of this mock trial, this special case file has been put together that contains all the police interviews with Stig Engström, all the police interviews with other witnesses relevant for the case against Engström, all other police documents pertaining to the case against Engström. And they have all been translated into English by a professional translator for the purpose of this mock trial. The panel received this case file 2 months ago, and they have studied it carefully, and the verdict that you will hear this afternoon is based on the case file. The prosecution and defense will be played by two esteemed legal scholars from Lund. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you, speaking for the prosecution, Lena Wahlberg, Associate Professor here at Lund University, and speaking for the defense, David Reidhav, Doctor of Law here at Lund University. The panel of judges is composed of 5 highly distinguished judges from 5 different countries, and it is my great pleasure to introduce them to you from left to right. From the Netherlands, Jelte Hilkema, Senior Judge at the Court of Appeal at Arnhem-Leeuwarden. From Italy, Stefania Riccio, Judge at the Supreme Court of Cassation in Rome. From Finland, Riku Jaakkola, Chief Judge at the District Court of Etelä-Pohjanmaa. From Switzerland, Mark Schweitzer, President of the Swiss Federal Patent Court. And from Denmark, Mikael Sjöberg, High Court Judge at the Eastern High Court in Copenhagen. And for today's mock trial, Riku Jaakkola will serve as the president of the court. Before we begin, I'd like to express our gratitude to the Söderberg Research Foundations. Their funding has made this mock trial possible, and we are very grateful for their financial support. So, let us begin. The indictment that will be tried here today reads as follows. On the 28th of February 1986, at approximately 23:21, Stig Engström murdered Olof Palme at the corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan in central Stockholm by shooting him in the back. So who was Stig Engström? Before I leave the floor to the prosecution and defense, I will just give you some very brief background facts about Stig Engström to keep in mind when you listen to their arguments. Stig Engström was 52 years old at the time of the murder. He was working as a graphical designer at the Skandia Insurance Company at their headquarters in central Stockholm on Sveavägen. The main entrance to the headquarters is indicated with the green cross on the map and is positioned about 60 meters north of the street corner where Olof Palme was assassinated. Engström was in the vicinity of the crime scene around the time of the murder. According to his own story, he exited the building, did not see the shooting or the shooter, was one of the very first to arrive at the crime scene, and he says that he helped out in various ways on the minutes after the murder. So with this, I give the floor to the prosecution and the defense.
I will begin by summarizing the main arguments against Stig Engström. Later today, I will explain each of these arguments in more detail to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that we have evidence that shows that Stig Engström is guilty of the murder of Olof Palme, the crime of which he is accused here today. The first argument is that Engström had perfect opportunity. We know for sure that Engström was close to the crime scene at the time of the murder. In fact, we know that he must have been just next to the crime scene at the very time of the murder. This is so because we know that Engström exited Skandia at 23:19 that evening. We also know that Olof and Lisbeth Palme walked past the entrance 30 seconds later, and that Olof Palme was shot 1 minute after that at the street corner. In other words, Palme was shot at the street corner outside Skandia 90 seconds after Engström left the building. The second main argument is that the descriptions that the eyewitnesses have provided of the killer fit perfectly with the way that Stig Engström looked that evening. This is true both of how he was dressed, a dark coat and a flat cap, and about his more general physical appearance. The third main argument is that Engström's appearance also fits with eyewitness descriptions of a running man on David Bagares gata shortly after the time of the murder. These descriptions include a man wearing a dark coat and a wristlet bag, two characteristics which are both true of Stig Engström this evening. The fourth main argument is that Engström is not telling the truth. We know for a fact that Stig Engström left Skandia at 23:19 and came back around 23:40. And of course, a tremendously important question is, what was Engström doing during these 20 minutes when Olof Palme was shot? Now, if you take a look at his own story of what he was doing during this time, it very soon becomes clear that his story changes over time. And moreover, it is full of flaws. So, for example, his story about being present and helping out at the crime scene is clearly contradicted by the other witnesses at the scene. Later, I will give many more examples to demonstrate the many inconsistencies and false statements in Engström's story. For now, it suffices to ask, what is the most plausible explanation of the fact that Engström is not telling us the truth, if not that Engström needed to hide what he really did during these 20 minutes? Namely that he, as corroborated by the other strong evidence here, killed Olof Palme. Thank you.
So I will also begin by outlining the main arguments, but for the defense. The prosecutor claims that Stig Engström had perfect opportunity. Now, opportunity does not equal guilt, and that Stig Engström committed this heinous act. As is clear from the testimonies in this case, Stig Engström has an alibi for the time of the shooting. He was then talking to the security guard Henry Olofsson at Skandia. As is also clear from the testimonies, the eyewitness Inge Morelius, he says that he observed the shooter waiting for Olof Palme a couple of minutes before the shooting. This makes it impossible that Stig Engström shot Olof Palme. He simply left Skandia too late for being able to wait for Olof Palme before the shooting. So contrary to what the prosecutor claims, Stig Engström had no opportunity. I urge the court today to listen very carefully to what evidence the prosecutor presents. The prosecutor has no forensic evidence whatsoever, no murder weapon tying Stig Engström to the crime. Now, the prosecutor stresses that Stig Engström's story of how he helped out, trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme, that it's incredible and not confirmed by the eyewitnesses. Now, the Swedish Prime Minister was shot on the night in question, so the crime scene was in a complete turmoil. The eyewitnesses' attention, of course, was not on Stig Engström. Their concern was not what Stig Engström was doing. Their attention was on the victim, Olof Palme, and the crime. So from the fact that the eyewitnesses do not confirm Stig Engström's story, from that we cannot conclude anything. Now, suppose that Stig Engström is exaggerating his role of how he helped out trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme. Suppose Stig Engström is even lying. What would it prove? It certainly does not prove that Stig Engström shot Olof Palme. At most, it would prove that Stig Engström had a desire to portray himself as having played an important part in a truly historic event. Nothing more. Stig Engström does not fit the profile of a killer. Stig Engström has no clear motive. Stig Engström has no history of violence. Stig Engström has no criminal connections. And he has no known connections to right-wing extremists.
So these are the main arguments from each side. You will now hear the prosecution and defense go into more detail and develop their arguments further. The exchange that you will hear will be structured around 3 topics: opportunity, eyewitness descriptions of the shooter, and Stig Engström's own story. So beginning with opportunity, before I again leave the floor to the prosecution and defense, here are a few brief facts that I think you should keep in mind when you listen to their arguments. First of all, the time of the murder. Olof Palme was assassinated at 23 hours, 21 minutes and 30 seconds, give or take 10 seconds. Stig Engström's punch-out time when leaving work is 23:19, and the punch-out clock does not register seconds. After punching out, he walked through the hallway of the main entrance at Skandia and exited the building. As you will hear, one thing that's contested is whether Engström stopped and chatted for a while with the security guards in the entrance hall, or whether he walked right out. According to the security guard Henry Olofsson, Engström did stop and chat for a few minutes with them. But according to Roland Bergström, another employee at Skandia who talked to Engström on the phone on the day after the murder, Engström himself says that he didn't stop, but just walked right past. And keep in mind also that the distance from the main entrance to the crime scene is approximately 60 meters.
I will now go through the events that led up to the murder to demonstrate that Engström had opportunity to commit this murder. We know that Olof Palme was shot at 23:21, right after he and Lisbeth Palme passed Skandia. And you can see this event to the right at the timeline here. We also know that Stig Engström punched out from Skandia at 23:19. And we also know that sometime that evening, before 9 o'clock, Stig Engström goes out to eat. We don't know exactly when, but there is a witness saying that he left Skandia at 8 o'clock. But in any case, we can be certain that Engström left the building to find something to eat before 9 o'clock. And we also know that Lisbeth and Olof Palme were at the Grand Cinema that evening to watch a movie. Other than that, we are not sure what happened. But based on these facts, there are many plausible scenarios in which Engström would have had the opportunity to shoot Palme, and which would explain the fact that he was carrying a gun in his pocket when he left Skandia. And I will now give you one example of one such scenario. So, to begin with, it is very possible that Stig Engström, after having left Skandia to find something to eat, spotted Palme outside the cinema. So let's assume that this happened. Let's assume that Engström sees Palme outside the cinema and decides to kill him after the show with a gun that he keeps in his office. So he goes back to his office to get his gun. Let us then assume that at 11 o'clock, Engström exits through a back door and goes back to the cinema. But for some reason, he aborts the plan. Maybe he just realized there were too many people around at the cinema. So he returns to Skandia. This means that when Engström punched out at 23:19, he still carries the gun. And when he by coincidence then spots Palme again just outside Skandia, he seizes the opportunity and shoots Palme. This is just one of several plausible scenarios which would explain why Engström had the gun in his pocket and hence an opportunity to kill Olof Palme when Engström met Olof and Lisbeth Palme outside Skandia the night of the murder. Before the defense is invited back to speak again, I would like to comment very briefly on two witness testimonies that I expect that the defense will make a big affair of. The two witnesses I have in mind are Henry Olofsson and Inge Morelius. The defense will probably claim that Olofsson and Morelius give Engström alibi. And this is so, the defense will probably claim, because Olofsson said that he and Engström chatted for a while before Engström left Skandia, which the defense will claim means that Engström could not have been at the place of the murder in time to kill Olof Palme. The defense will probably also claim that Morelius saw the killer waiting at the crime scene for a couple of minutes before the shooting, which also, according to the defense, would mean that Engström could not have been the killer. I would now like to draw your attention to an important insight from witness psychology which totally undermines the reliability of these two testimonies. First of all, please note that both these testimonies are about observations made before the time of the murder. Witness psychology has taught us that observations made before a dramatic event cannot be trusted. And the reason for that is that a witness has no particular reason to pay attention to what happens before the dramatic event takes place. And once the dramatic event does take place, that event will overshadow and distort the memories of what happened right before it. So, when you listen to the defense, I urge you to keep in mind this important lesson from witness psychology. Maintain a skeptical attitude towards testimony about observations made before a dramatic event. Thank you.
Now we know for a fact that Stig Engström punched out from Skandia 19 minutes past 11. We know this from the punch-out clock at Skandia. The punch-out clock at Skandia did not show seconds. So 19 minutes past 11 here can mean anything from 19 minutes and 0 seconds past 11 to 19 minutes and 59 seconds past 11. Olof Palme was shot at 21 minutes and 30 seconds past 11. This would then give Stig Engström anything from 2.5 to 1.5 minutes to walk from the punch-out clock to the lobby, exit the building, walk to the crime scene, prepare for the shooting, and shoot Olof Palme. That is not a lot of time. However, we know from the testimony of Henry Olofsson, who worked as a security guard at Skandia, that he and Stig Engström chatted for a couple of minutes after Stig Engström punched out, but before he left the building. With the permission of the court, I would like to read an excerpt from the testimony of Henry Olofsson. Henry Olofsson says, "We were there chatting. Stig Engström came in. The interrogating officer asks, 'From where?' Henry Olofsson replies, 'From inside the building, probably from his office and down the stairs. And yes, I chatted with him a fair bit. Asked if he had a lot to do, and he said he had finished off a job that had to be done before he went on holiday the following week. Then we stood and chatted for a couple of minutes." Note here that Henry Olofsson does not only remember that he and Stig Engström chatted for a couple of minutes. He remembers exactly what they were chatting about, namely Stig Engström's upcoming holiday. So this testimony of Henry Olofsson is very credible. Now, if Stig Engström punched out 19 minutes past 11 and then chatted a couple of minutes with Henry Olofsson, then we are well past the time of the shooting, which occurred at 21 minutes and 30 seconds past 11. In effect, the testimony of Henry Olofsson supplies Stig Engström with an alibi for the time of the shooting. There is also one eyewitness who perfectly overlooks the crime scene for a couple of minutes before the shooting. The eyewitness in question is Inge Morelius. If we look at a map here, we have a dot where it says I am. That is where Inge Morelius is positioned. And Inge Morelius is sitting in his car, waiting for a couple of friends, on the other side of Sveavägen, perfectly overlooking the crime scene. Now Inge Morelius reports that he observes the shooter waiting for Olof Palme a couple of minutes before the shooting. With the permission of the court, I would then like to read also an excerpt from the testimony of Inge Morelius. Inge Morelius says, he, the shooter, was standing there waiting in cold blood. He knew they would go that way. The interrogating officer asks, "How long before that were you watching him? How close was he the first time you saw him?" Inge Morelius replies, "So I had stopped on the other side of Sveavägen. I had just turned the car around and we are talking a matter of minutes." And later on, Inge Morelius says that he watched the killer for about 3 to 4 minutes. For it to be possible for Inge Morelius to observe Stig Engström for a couple of minutes before the shooting, then Stig Engström would simply have to have left Skandia earlier than he did. For an example, for it to be possible for Inge Morelius to observe Stig Engström for 4 minutes before the shooting, then Stig Engström would have to have left Skandia at the latest 17 minutes and 30 seconds past 11. But we know that Stig Engström punched out 19 minutes past 11. So the testimony of Inge Morelius makes it impossible that Stig Engström shot Olof Palme. He simply left Skandia too late. Now the prosecutor claims that the testimony of Inge Morelius is not credible. And as I understand the reasoning here, the reasoning is that it concerns an observation prior to the shooting. So Inge Morelius would have no reason to have paid any attention to Stig Engström. However, as the prosecutor is well aware, the very reason why Inge Morelius observed and paid attention to the shooter prior to the shooting was that he felt that something was wrong, something was off. He explicitly says in his testimony that the reason why he observed the shooter in the first place was that he thought that the shooter was a bag snatcher or something. That's why the shooter caught his attention prior to the crime. And from the point where Inge Morelius first pays attention to the shooter, he observed him continuously up until the very shooting. So the testimony of Inge Morelius is also very credible. So in sum then, Stig Engström has an alibi for the time of the shooting, and the testimony of Inge Morelius simply makes it impossible that Stig Engström shot Olof Palme. Stig Engström simply left Skandia too late.
So we are now moving on from the topic of opportunity to the next topic, which is eyewitness descriptions. There are many eyewitness testimonies regarding the shooting of Olof Palme. 22 eyewitnesses have said in police interviews that they either saw parts of the shooting or saw the assassin flee down Tunnelgatan. This is because Sveavägen is a busy street in central Stockholm, so there were a lot of people around at the time of the murder. Some of them were pedestrians. Many of them were sitting in cars at the intersection of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan, at the red light, waiting for the light to switch. In addition to these 22 witnesses, there are many further witnesses who made observations in the area around the crime scene around the time of the murder that could be relevant. You will soon hear arguments from the prosecution and defense, and they will mention some of these witnesses in particular. So therefore, before I give them the floor again, I will show you where exactly these 6 witnesses were positioned on the map. Number 1, Lisbeth Palme says that she was walking arm in arm with her husband Olof. She says that when they approached the street corner, she heard a bang from behind. Olof fell to the ground. She says that she looked around for help and saw a person fleeing down Tunnelgatan. Number 2, Anders Björkman was walking on the pavement behind the Palmes. According to his own estimate, he was about 5 or 10 meters behind them. He says that when they were approaching the street corner, he observed 3 people in front of him that he perceived to be in company, when suddenly one of them shot one of the other. Björkman was terrified and backed into a doorway where he stood in shock for several minutes. Number 3, Inge Morelius, already mentioned by the defense, was sitting in his car on the other side of Sveavägen, parked at the curb overlooking the crime scene. He was waiting for some friends who were withdrawing cash from an ATM machine, and Morelius says that he observed a man standing at the street corner waiting for several minutes before the assassination. And when the Palmes passed, stepped out behind and fired his gun. Number 4, Anna Hage was sitting in the back seat of a car that was standing at the red light. She says that she heard the shooting, immediately got out of the car, ran over to help out, and helped out collaborating, doing first aid in collaboration with a young man called Stefan Glantz, another witness who had also just arrived. Number 5, Lars Jeppsson, says that he was at the corner of Luntmakargatan and Sveavägen when he heard the gunshots from the corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan, and when he realized that someone was running in his direction, he hid behind the Porta cabins on Tunnelgatan. He says that he heard someone running past on the other side, and he looked out, and he says that he saw the man from behind passing and running up the stairs. Jeppsson says that he took a step forward, followed the man with his eyes when he ran up the stairs, and at the top of the stairs, the man stopped and turned around. And then he was gone. Number 6, Yvonne Nieminen was walking on David Bagares gata. She was walking in the direction of the crime scene just after the shooting, and she says that she observed a man who was running in the opposite direction on the other side of the street. A man in a dark coat, a man who was carrying a small bag. Yvonne Nieminen says that it seems that he was fiddling with the bag, maybe trying to put something into the bag. So these are the 6 witnesses. I now give again the word to the prosecution and defense.
In addition to the fact that Engström, as I have demonstrated, had the opportunity to kill Palme, the eyewitness descriptions of the murderer provide very strong evidence that it was Stig Engström who shot Olof Palme. I will present the witnesses' descriptions shortly, but let us first acquaint ourselves with Engström's appearance the night of the murder. To the right on this slide is a picture of Stig Engström, and to the left I will list the characteristics of Stig Engström's physical appearance, including his clothes and the accessories that he was wearing this particular evening. As to body build, Stig Engström was 1 meter and 82 centimeters tall. He was also slightly stout. At the night of the murder, Engström was wearing a dark, long overcoat. On his head, he was wearing a flat cap of the kind you can see in the picture. He came directly from work, so he was presumably wearing office shoes. And in his hand, he carried a wristlet bag, the same bag that he is carrying at this picture. Let us now look at how the eyewitnesses' descriptions fit with Stig Engström's physical appearance the night of the murder. So first, we have seen that Stig Engström's height was 1 meter and 82 centimeters. And this fits very well with Lisbeth Palmer's testimony that the murderer was 1 meter and 80 centimeters. It also fits perfectly with the witness Lars Jeppsson's description of the killer as being somewhere between 180 and 185 centimeters. And when we consider these two testimonies, we should recall that Lisbeth Palmer is an extremely important witness because she actually met with the killer. And the same goes for Lars Jeppsson, who is the witness who saw the killer for the longest time at a close range. Second, we have seen that Engström was slightly stout. Lars Jeppsson again testifies that the killer had a broad back, which hence fits well with Engström. Moreover, Yvonne Nieminen confirmed that the running man she saw on David Bagares gata had the same body build as Engström. Third, Stig Engström was wearing a dark long overcoat the night of the murder. Anna Hage testifies that the killer was wearing a 3/4 length coat, and Inge Morelius testifies that the killer was wearing a dark long coat. Fourth, Stig Engström was wearing a flat cap the night of the murder, and Lars Jeppsson, who, as I just mentioned, was the witness who saw the killer for the longest time at a close range, testifies that the killer was wearing a flat cap. And fifth, we have already concluded that Engström was wearing office shoes. And Yvonne Nieminen testifies that the man she met on David Bagares gata was slipping in the snow as he ran, which clearly indicates that the fleeing man was wearing office shoes. Sixth, we know for sure that Engström carried a wristlet bag this evening. He has confirmed that himself. Yvonne Nieminen has testified that the man she saw running away from the crime scene along David Bagares gata was carrying a small bag which looked like a wristlet bag.
According to the prosecutor, Stig Engström fits the eyewitness's description of the shooter. Well, who doesn't fit the eyewitness's description of the shooter? The eyewitnesses described the shooter as a man of medium height wearing an overcoat or a long jacket. This is wholly generic, fitting almost every Swedish male who was out in Stockholm on the night of the murder. Since this does not discriminate, it becomes entirely useless as a piece of evidence. The general description is what the eyewitnesses agree on. If we look at specific details about the shooter, the eyewitnesses disagree with one another. If, for an example, we look at what the eyewitnesses say with respect to the shooter's headwear, which is important in this case, the eyewitnesses disagree with one another. The eyewitness Anders Björkman says that the shooter wore a knitted beanie hat. Anna Hage says that the shooter was bare-headed. Inge Morelius says that the shooter wore a knitted beanie hat. And Lars Jeppsson says, according to the prosecutor, that the shooter wore a flat cap. So, Stig Engström does not fit the majority of eyewitnesses' description here. What the prosecutor does is simply cherry-picking, picking the one testimony that fits with Stig Engström and disregards the rest. Not only is the prosecutor cherry-picking, the prosecutor chooses to interpret a very vague and very imprecise testimony of Lars Jeppsson so that it fits with Stig Engström. With the permission of the court, I would also like to read an excerpt from the testimony of Lars Jeppsson, which goes to show that Lars Jeppsson is not at all that clear about the shooter's headwear, as the prosecutor claims. The interrogating officer asks, "And describe what you saw." Lars Jeppsson: "I saw a broad back and something on his head that looked like a flat cap, some sort of cap." A little bit further on in the testimony, he says, the interrogating officer asks, "Did it have ear flaps or something?" Lars Jeppsson: "Ear flaps, I didn't notice, or perhaps I didn't think about it." The interrogating officer asks, "Not? Could you see his ears?" Lars Jeppsson: "Nope." The interrogating officer asks, "You didn't?" Lars Jeppsson: "Yes. The only thing I remember was that it was like dark headwear." This is then the testimony that the prosecutor relies on in support of the shooter wearing a flat cap. What is even the testimony here? Is it that the shooter wore a flat cap? Or is the testimony rather that the shooter had some sort of dark headwear? Like, for an example, a dark knitted beanie hat. The eyewitness Yvonne Nieminen reports that she saw a man running and slipping. From this, the prosecutor concludes that it must have been Stig Engström, since Stig Engström wore office shoes and had a wristlet bag. Now, the man Yvonne Nieminen observed running was not near the crime scene. Yvonne Nieminen did not see the actual shooting. The man she observed running on a street far away from the crime scene, namely on David Bagares gata. From David Bagares gata, it is not possible to see the crime scene. So how can the prosecutor be sure that the man Yvonne Nieminen saw was the shooter? It is fully possible that the man Yvonne Nieminen saw was someone who was fully unconnected to the shooting. Accordingly, we cannot be sure that Yvonne Nieminen's description is a description of the shooter. The man Yvonne Nieminen saw was slipping, so the prosecutor concludes that it must have been Stig Engström, since Stig Engström had office shoes. However, anyone running on the icy and snowy roads of Stockholm on the night in question would have slipped, regardless of footwear. So from the information that the person was slipping, we cannot infer anything with respect to the person's footwear. All that can be inferred is the already known fact that the roads were icy and snowy. Nothing more. The man Yvonne Nieminen saw carried a bag, so the prosecutor concludes that it must have been Stig Engström, since Stig Engström carried a wristlet bag. However, none of the other 22 witnesses reports having seen a bag. Isn't a reasonable conclusion then that the shooter did not have a bag rather than the shooter having a bag? Yvonne Nieminen doesn't report seeing specifically a wristlet bag. She doesn't describe the bag having a strap, as Stig Engström's wristlet bag had. Moreover, the wristlet bag that Stig Engström had on the night in question is much too small to fit a Magnum revolver in, which was used on the night in question. The one eyewitness who was in the far best position to observe what the shooter looked like was Lisbeth Palme. Lisbeth Palme was right next to the shooter. Lisbeth Palme identified the shooter in a police lineup in 1988 as Christer Pettersson. And here we have a picture of the police lineup, and Christer Pettersson is number 7 in the lineup. Now, if we compare Christer Pettersson and Stig Engström, they bear no resemblance whatsoever to each other. Christer Pettersson has distinctly dark features. Stig Engström has distinctly light features. Christer Pettersson does not have a round face. Stig Engström has a distinctly round face. Christer Pettersson doesn't wear glasses. Stig Engström wears glasses. If Stig Engström was the shooter, then Lisbeth Palme would simply not have identified the shooter as Christer Pettersson. They are simply too unalike. It should also be pointed out that Lisbeth Palme has maintained that Christer Pettersson was the shooter ever since she first identified him in 1988 as the shooter.
We will now continue with our last topic, Stig Engström's own story. And again, before I leave the floor to the prosecution and defense, I will give you some brief background facts to keep in mind when you listen to their arguments. Stig Engström contacted the police on the day after the murder, said that he had some important information. He also contacted the media, newspapers and TV. So we have many accounts of his story. Many records. We have the police interviews, we have newspaper articles, testimonies from friends and co-workers, and he also appeared in 1989 at the trial of Christer Pettersson as a witness. There are discrepancies between the various accounts of his story, but I'm going to give you the core elements of his story. Engström says that he exited and started walking briskly southward in the direction of the crime scene. He says that he was in a hurry to catch the subway, that he was looking down at his wristwatch to check the time. According to his own account, he was about 20 meters from the crime scene at the shooting. But he says that he heard a bang but didn't realize that it was a gunshot, thinking that it was maybe the exhaust pipe of a passing car. So according to his own story, although he was so close, he didn't see the shooting or the shooter because he was looking down at his wristwatch. He says that when he came to the street corner, he more or less stumbled across this body lying on the street. He realized that it was a person who had been shot, but did not recognize the Prime Minister. Engström says that he was one of the very first to arrive at the crime scene after the murder. He says that there was an older woman there who was quite hysterical. He also says that there was a young woman and a young man there who were kneeling beside the body, starting to do first aid. According to his own story, he helped them. He helped out by suggesting that the body be put in the recovery position to clear the airways. He also said that he tried to talk to the older woman and managed to do so. That she told him that the shooter had fled down Tunnelgatan and was wearing a blue quilted jacket. Engström claims that he then peered down Tunnelgatan and saw a man standing at the end of the alley, looking in his direction, wearing a quilted jacket. He says that he thought that he saw the assassin looking back at him. And then the man was gone. Police vehicles came to the scene, police officers came out. Engström says that he helped them when they asked which way the assassin had run, pointing them down Tunnelgatan. And they ran down the street in pursuance of the shooter. Engström says that as soon as they had run away, he suddenly realized that he should have told them that they were looking for a man in a blue quilted jacket. So he says that he ran after the police officers to inform them about this, but didn't manage to catch up with them. He says that he ran all the way down to the end of Tunnelgatan without catching up to them, and then walked back, returning to the crime scene. He says that when he came back, the ambulance had arrived, more people had gathered, and he says that he overheard a police officer interviewing one of the witnesses. And he says that he overheard the witness describing what the assassin looked like, but instead of a blue quilted jacket, described the assassin in a way that fitted with himself, Engström, as a man with a dark coat and a flat cap. Engström says that he then thought that this witness had seen him running after the police officer and somehow got the description of him mixed up with the description of the assassin. He says that he approached the police officer and tried to correct this error, but no one would listen to him. The ambulance drove off, and Engström said that someone in the crowd told him that the victim was Olof Palme, and it was first at that time that he realized that he was the victim. He had not realized that earlier. He says that he went back to Skandia, knocked on the door, the security guards let him in, and he told them what had happened.
Engström's story, or rather his many different stories, about what he did during the 20 minutes between 23:19, when he left Skandia, and 23:40, when he came back, is full of flaws. To begin with, the story, or the many different stories, are self-contradictory and hence inconsistent. But not only are the stories inconsistent, they are also full of incorrect details. Moreover, the explanation that Engström gives is very hard to believe in. It's incredible, unrealistic. And last but not least, Engström's story is not confirmed, but rather contradicted by other witnesses. In other words, it is clear that Engström is not telling us the truth. Now, one wonders, of course, why Engström decided to contact the police to tell all these incredible stories in the first place. A plausible explanation is that Engström saw on the news that some witnesses claimed that the witness wore a coat and a flat cap. One could assume that this made him scared, that he would become a suspect, and that he decided to act proactively and contact the police himself. But as shown on this slide here, Engström's own story is so full of flaws that it only makes sense if we see it for what it is. Namely, a desperate but fruitless attempt to hide what I claim is the truth. Namely, that Engström himself was the killer of Olof Palme. I will now explain each of these points in more detail. To begin with, the different stories that Stig Engström provides about what he was doing this night are inconsistent. Here is a clear example of the different versions of his whereabouts that contradict one another. The first version of his story is the one he tells to the security guards at Skandia on the night of the murder. This is Engström's first story. There was a shooting. A man told him the victim was Olof Palme. Palme was lying on the pavement and there was blood coming out of his mouth. In this version, Engström does not portray himself as active at the crime scene. He does not say he helped out giving Palme CPR. And he does not say that he ran after the police officers. Instead, he portrays himself as a passive bystander. On the following day, when Engström is interviewed by the newspaper, his story has changed, because in the version that he is now telling, he plays an active part, helping out when Palme was given CPR. He also says he ran down Tunnelgatan after the police officers. And he says that a witness got him mixed up with the killer and told the police that the killer wore a long coat and a flat cap. What could have prompted these dramatic changes in Engström's story? Well, as I said earlier, the only plausible explanation is that Engström realized when he heard the news that he needed an explanation if he would be identified as the killer by a witness. So he simply invented the second version here, where he was confused with the killer. Engström's story is not only inconsistent, it is also pervaded by incorrect details. First, Engström is not telling us the truth when he says that he was in a hurry to catch a metro to Mörby Centrum a few minutes after 11:30. This is obviously not true, because the train from T-centralen to Mörby Centrum leaves at 23:48, and it takes only 10 minutes to walk from Skandia to T-centralen. In other words, Engström is in no hurry to catch this train after he exited Skandia at 23:19. He has almost half an hour at his disposal for a walk taking 10 minutes that it takes basically every day. Second, Engström gives an incorrect description of the crime scene and of the position of Palme's body. Because Engström says in several interviews that Palme was initially lying on his back after the murder. But when Palme was shot, he fell forward, hitting his forehead to the ground. And he was lying face down on the pavement until people started turning him over. Moreover, Engström said in a police interview that Palme's mouth was open, his eyes were closed. But this was clearly false, as shown by the testimony of another witness, Anna Hage, who was doing CPR on Palme. And with the permission of the court, I will now quote a police interview with Hage, made 1 hour after the murder. So in this interview, 1 hour after the murder, Hage says Palme appeared lifeless and had glassy eyes. Third, according to Engström's story, he talked to Lisbeth Palme and she told him that the killer had fled down Tunnelgatan and was wearing a blue quilted jacket. This does not fit with the testimonies made by the people who were present at the crime scene. So, for example, when Karin Johansson is interviewed by the police 1 hour after the murder, she describes Lisbeth Palme as a woman in complete shock, understandably. And Johansson does not say anything about Mrs. Palme giving a description of the killer. And no one else, except Stig Engström, claims Lisbeth Palme made such a statement. And fourth, my last example, Engström claims that the witness at the crime scene said to the police that the killer was wearing a dark coat and a flat cap. But there is no documentation in any report of a witness having made such a statement at the crime scene. Again, these are just a few of several examples of incorrect statements in Engström's story. And of course, there are also some details that are correct, but he could easily have picked those details up from a newspaper article. Engström's story is not only inconsistent and full of incorrect details, it is also completely incredible. Here are 2 examples. According to Engström's story, he was 20 meters from the corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan when Olof Palme was shot. So Engström claims that he was at spot 1 on this map, while the shooting took place at spot 2. Nevertheless, he didn't notice the shooting because he was busy checking the time at his watch. This can't be true. It is a matter of public knowledge that the sounds from a Magnum revolver are extremely loud. It's around 160 decibels, a bit like being inside the speakers at a rock concert. It is simply impossible that the shooting would not have caught Engström's attention if it happened right in front of him at such a close distance. Engström also says he saw a man standing at the end of Tunnelgatan. He describes that man as being a young man with a padded jacket and curly hair. And this fits exactly with Lars Jeppsson. And when Engström is shown a picture of Jeppsson, he confirms that that is the man he observed. Now, as we know from Jeppsson's testimony, he was at the end of Tunnelgatan at spot 3 on this map. And this means that there is a serious problem with Engström's statement here. Because Tunnelgatan is a poorly lit alley. And it is simply impossible that Engström standing at spot 2 would be able to observe Jeppson standing at spot 3, 80 meters away from him in a poorly lit alley. So under these circumstances, how could Engström possibly make a correct observation of Jeppson's blue padded jacket and curly hair? The only reasonable explanation is that Engström saw Jeppson after Engström had shot Olof Palme and after he had ran down Tunnelgatan himself and up the stairs. Because as we know from Jeppson's testimony, when the killer reached the top of the stairs, he turned around at spot 4 on this picture, and he looked back at Jeppson at the bottom of the stairs. This must be the moment when Engström observed Jeppson. Engström, the murderer, could observe Jeppson from the top of the stairs at spot 4. But Engström, the witness, standing at spot 2, could not have identified Jeppson and described his jacket and hair correctly. In addition to being inconsistent, full of incorrect details, and incredible, it is important to note that Engström's story is not confirmed, but rather contradicted by the other witnesses at the crime scene. So to begin with, if Engström would have been where he claims he was, he would have walked 10 meters behind the witness Anders Björkman. At this picture here, Björkman is at spot 1, and Engström would be at the green cross, walking right behind him. If this were so, how come Björkman is missing from Engström's story? Furthermore, when the shots rang out, Björkman backed into a doorway where he stood in shock for several minutes. If Engström had arrived at the crime scene when he claims he did, he would have passed right in front of Björkman. But Björkman did not observe Engström. Moreover, the witnesses who noted Björkman in the doorway do not mention Engström passing him. Second, Engström claims that he, Hage, and Glans worked together to save Palme's life. In fact, Engström even says that it was his idea to roll Palme over into the recovery position. And when Engström is interviewed in Aftenposten on March 3rd, he also added that he had participated in the attempts to feel Palme's pulse. Nothing of this is true. Hage, who was giving Palme CPR, says she collaborated with Glans, but she has no recollection of Engström. According to Engström's story, he talked to Lisbeth Palme and she told him the killer had fled down Tunnelgatan and was wearing a blue quilted jacket. But in Lisbeth Palme's own testimony, she doesn't mention talking to a man who could have been Engström or telling him that the killer wore a blue quilted jacket. Finally, one thing that definitely ought to have been observed by other witnesses is that Engström, according to his own story, ran after the police to tell them the killer was wearing a blue quilted jacket. If he would have done that, that would surely have been observed by the other witnesses at the crime scene. However, no witness said they observed a man running after the police officers. I will now show you what it looked like when Engström himself demonstrated in a TV interview on April 6 how he ran down the alley after the police. Is it even possible that a person could run like that from a crime scene full of witnesses without being observed? I invite you to take a look at this again, and please observe how the people around Engström react as he is running here. To summarize, these many flaws in Engström's story mean that we can infer with certainty that he is not telling us the truth about what he was doing between 2319, where he left Skandia, and 2340 when he came back, the time when the murder of Olof Palme took place. Why then would Engström not tell the truth? I claim that the only plausible explanation is that he tried to hide that he himself shot Olof Palme. And that concludes the case for the prosecution. Thank you.
Now, the prosecutor points to different incorrect details in Stig Engström's story and concludes that Stig Engström is lying. The way this is shown by the prosecutor is remarkable. The method employed by the prosecutor is to compare the story of Stig Engström with the story of another eyewitness. And if the stories differ, it is concluded that Stig Engström's story is false and Stig Engström is lying. But then the prosecutor assumes from the start that Stig Engström's story is false and Stig Engström is lying. So what the prosecutor does here is simply to assume from the start that Stig Engström's story is false and that he's lying. For an example, Stig Engström said that it was possible to speak to Lisbeth Palme on the night of the murder. Another eyewitness says that this was not possible. The prosecutor then concludes that Stig Engström's story is false and that Stig Engström is lying. But then the prosecutor simply begs the question. The prosecutor assumes from the start what the prosecutor intends to prove here. Stig Engström reported that Olof Palme was on his back with his eyes closed. The prosecutor says that this is false. What we know is that initially Olof Palme was not on his back, but eventually he was turned over so that CPR could be performed on him. So it is not false, as Stig Engström says, that Olof Palme was on his back. It just depends on what time after the shooting we look at. Stig Engström claimed that he felt he was in a hurry to catch the metro. The prosecutor says that this cannot be true. Stig Engström, according to the prosecutor, had plenty of time to catch the metro. The metro left Hötorget, which is the closest metro station, 32 minutes past 11. This gave Stig Engström approximately 10 minutes to walk to the metro station. How can the prosecutor possibly know whether or not Stig Engström felt that he was in a hurry? This is a purely subjective feeling, and it's hardly counterintuitive. Who has not felt in a hurry 10 minutes before departure and not being on the station? The feeling is natural. Unforeseen circumstances can occur. Now, the prosecutor points to different inconsistencies in Stig Engström's story and concludes that he is lying. Stig Engström told the security guards at Skandia that he was a passive bystander. Later, when he spoke to newspapers and the police, Stig Engström said that he had an active role in trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme. Now, Stig Engström has never claimed that he performed the actual CPR. The actual CPR was performed by Anna Hage and Stefan Glantz. Stig Engström has only said that he helped seeing to it that Olof Palme was placed in a recovery position so that his airways were cleared. So, in one sense, it is true, as Stig Engström told the security guards at Skandia on the night of the murder, that he was a passive bystander. Namely, in the sense that the ones that were performing the actual CPR was Anna Hage and Stefan Glantz. And in another sense, it is true, as Stig Engström said later to newspapers and the police, that he had an active role in trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme. Namely, in the sense that he helped seeing to it that Olof Palme was placed in a recovery position. So, these are then two different but true descriptions of the same event. There is no inconsistency here. Stig Engström is just focusing on different but true descriptions of the same event when he speaks to the security guards and later when he speaks to newspapers and the police. There is also a very natural and easy explanation for why Stig Engström's story changes over time. On the night of the murder, he was in shock. It is only natural that his story becomes more detailed once he has composed himself and thought the events true. Now, the defense admits that there are inconsistencies in Stig Engström's story. For an example, Stig Engström has reported that he punched out 20 minutes past 11. He has also reported that he punched out 22 minutes past 11. The prosecutor takes these inconsistencies as signs of Stig Engström lying. However, if we look at research in witness psychology, inconsistencies are not signs of a witness lying. Instead, inconsistencies are signs of a witness attempting or trying to be truthful. So these inconsistencies should rather be seen as signs of Stig Engström attempting to tell the truth here. Now, this is really important. Suppose Stig Engström is exaggerating his role in trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme. Let's suppose he's even lying. What does it prove? It certainly does not prove that Stig Engström shot Olof Palme. At most, it would go to prove that Stig Engström had a desire to portray himself as being important, being at the very center of a truly historic event. Nothing more. According to the prosecutor, Stig Engström's story of how he helped out in trying to rescue the life of Olof Palme, his story is not confirmed by the eyewitnesses. There exists a very simple explanation for why the eyewitnesses do not confirm Stig Engström's story. The eyewitnesses were simply not asked any questions during the police investigation about Stig Engström. Initially, Stig Engström was not considered a suspect. Once he became a suspect, he was quickly written off by the police after the police cross-checked his account. So the eyewitnesses were never during the police investigation asked questions specifically about Stig Engström and what Stig Engström was doing on the night of the murder. In this respect, the police investigation is flawed. So what the prosecutor is doing here is using a flawed police investigation as evidence against Stig Engström. Now, the prosecutor has shown the court video footage of Stig Engström's story of how he ran after the police. That video footage is, of course, not from the night of the murder. That video footage, zooming in on Stig Engström in broad daylight, is a huge misrepresentation of the crime scene. The crime scene was in a complete turmoil. Olof Palme was bleeding to death. There were people performing CPR. There were ambulances, police cars. Cars were being stopped. Lisbeth Palme was screaming. Police officers were running around. That was what the eyewitnesses saw. The eyewitnesses' attention, of course, was not on Stig Engström and what Stig Engström was doing. No one would simply pay attention to him running on the crime scene. There were too much chaos going on. Now, what actually happened on the night of the murder is for the prosecutor to prove. The prosecutor must prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. If we look here at what evidence the prosecutor has presented today, the prosecutor has presented evidence to the effect that Stig Engström was in the vicinity of the crime, having opportunity. But, as we have seen, Stig Engström has an alibi for the time of the shooting. He was then talking to the security guard, Henry Olofsson. The prosecutor has presented evidence to the effect that Stig Engström fits the description of some eyewitnesses given. But, as we have seen, Stig Engström does not fit the majority of eyewitnesses' description of the shooter. The prosecutor has presented evidence to the effect that Stig Engström's story is incredible and that it contains inconsistencies. However, the story is not that incredible, and if it is deemed incredible, there exists a simple explanation. Stig Engström wants to portray himself as important. As a matter of law, a prosecutor should not bring a suit unless there are compelling evidence for a conviction. If we look at this case, there is no evidence for a conviction, simply assumptions and speculations. So this case should never have been brought before this court today. Thank you.
So, welcome back. We will now hear the panel present the verdict. As I explained to you this morning, they have based the verdict on this case file, a case file that consists all the evidence, all the police interviews with Stig Engström and other relevant Engström evidence in the case against Engström. It's all been translated into English by a professional translator who's sitting here in the audience. The panel received the case file 2 months ago. They have studied it carefully. They have deliberated behind closed doors. They have not talked to me or anyone else, so I'm just as curious as you to hear their assessment. Please.
Thank you, Christian. First of all, as Christian mentioned, the panel has carefully studied the case file, and we have tried to answer all the main arguments, pro and contra, as presented in the case file. We have written the verdict beforehand, based on the closing arguments as they were presented in the case file. However, the closing arguments presented here today differ slightly from the closing arguments presented in the case file. I'm not sure if this works. Okay, but it's all.
Does it work, Christian? Yes?
Okay, okay. Sorry. As I was saying, the closing arguments presented here today orally differ slightly from the closing arguments presented in the case file. Therefore, our reasoning contains also sections about motive and murder weapon, which were not argued here today, but those were included in the closing arguments presented in the case file. And each judge of the panel will now read a part of the verdict. I will start. We will start with the reasoning. The panel has gone through all the arguments pro and contra and evaluated all the evidence and other documents presented in the case file. Each argument and each piece of evidence has been first considered separately, and then the panel has assessed the evidentiary value of the facts and evidence combined. First, opportunity. Olof Palme was shot about 60 meters from the main entrance of the Skandia headquarters where Engström worked. According to the testimony of Roland Bergström, Engström used his access card to clock out from Skandia at 23:20, but the punch clock ran 1 minute ahead, so the correct time was 23:19. There is no reason to suspect the accuracy of Bergström's testimony, so it can be taken as a fact that Engström clocked out at 23:19. According to the testimony of Henry Olofsson, a security guard at Skandia, Engström sat it with him for a couple of minutes before he left the building. Olofsson was interviewed by the police 3 months after the murder. The panel notes that Olofsson's time estimate is rough, and it's also possible that he doesn't remember the conversation correctly, since 3 months had already passed from the event. Therefore, Olofsson's testimony cannot be considered as sufficient evidence that Engström and Olofsson talked for a few minutes before Engström left the building. When assessing whether Engström could have arrived at the murder scene in time, it should also be considered that 23:21:30 is not the precise time of the murder. It is possible that the murder took place some 10 seconds earlier or later. And now, later you will receive this written verdict also. And this part, what I'm now reading, is not in that version. So this I just add here now. The defense has referred to the testimony of Inge Morelius. According to Morelius, the killer waited at the corner for 3 to 4 minutes. The panel notes that the testimony of Inge Morelius is in contradiction with the testimonies of other witnesses. Therefore, his testimony does not prove that Engström had an alibi. After evaluating all the facts and evidence, the panel concludes that it is possible that Engström had enough time to walk to the crime scene and commit the murder. No concrete evidence has been presented whether Engström had or could have had a gun with him. There are only various theories and speculations. The panel states that it is possible that Engström had a gun with him, but in the absence of evidence, this mere possibility cannot be given probative value against Engström. Now, eyewitness descriptions of the killer. The police have interviewed several eyewitnesses and many of them multiple times. Some of the descriptions fit Engström in some respects. According to several witnesses, the killer was a man of medium height, 180, 185 centimeters. Many eyewitnesses have said that the killer was wearing a dark coat which went below the waist and dark trousers, not jeans. Some eyewitnesses have also mentioned that the killer was wearing a flat cap. All these descriptions fit Engström. On the other hand, there are also conflicting descriptions that do not fit Engström. For example, the description provided by Lisbeth Palme does not fit Engström, as she describes the killer as wearing a dark blue kilted jacket. Some witnesses describe the killer as wearing a beanie or knitted hat. For example, Anders Björkman, Inge Morelius, or that the killer had no hat at all, and for example, Anne Hage, Leif Lundqvist, and Jan Andersson, and some witnesses told that the killer was wearing a leather jacket, Jan Nilsson, for example. Most witnesses estimate the age of the killer as between 30 and 45 years, with Egon Enoksson having the impression that the killer was quite young. Engström was 52 at the time of the assassination. The panel notes that many descriptions are quite general and also fit many other men. Most importantly, none of the witnesses claims to have seen the face of the killer in a way that it permits the identification. Therefore, no eyewitness has identified Engström as the murderer, even though he appeared in numerous newspaper articles and also on television. Furthermore, empirical psychological studies have shown that there are several factors that undermine the reliability of witness testimonies. For example, witnesses' own interpretations, experiences, and post-event information can distort the witness's memory and influence the testimony. In this case, many witnesses have been interviewed several times, and the murder has raised huge publicity in the media. Numerous newspaper articles and radio and TV shows may have influenced the witnesses' memories and consequently also their testimonies. In some witnesses' police interviews, leading questions were also observed, which may have affected their testimonies. The prosecution has referred to the testimony of Yvonne Nieminen. Nieminen has testified that she saw a stocky man wearing a dark jacket running along David Pakaresgata, carrying a small bag in his hand and trying to open or close the zipper. He was sliding in the snow on the pavement. According to the prosecution, this man must have been the murderer, and the man's description fits Engström because he was carrying a wristlet bag and was wearing slippery office shoes on the night of the murder. The panel assesses that there is not enough evidence to support the argument that the man Nieminen saw was the murderer. Furthermore, Nieminen has not identified Engström as the man she saw. A wristlet bag and office shoes are generic clues and not conclusive evidence. There is not enough evidence to support the prosecution's argument that the man Nieminen saw was Engström. Considering all the uncertainties related to the descriptions of the eyewitnesses, the panel concludes that the eyewitness descriptions cannot be regarded as evidence of Engström's guilt. Now, moving on.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now it's Engström's story. Engström has been interviewed by the police several times as a witness. He has given multiple interviews to newspapers and he has appeared on television. He has also testified as a witness in the trial against Christer Petersson in both the Stockholm District Court and Svea Court of Appeal. The prosecution has argued that Engström's story has changed several times and that his story contradicts the testimonies of other witnesses. None of the eyewitnesses have recognized Engström at the crime scene, even though he has claimed that he played a significant role in the attempts to save Olof Palme's life and in aiding the police to catch the murder. The panel notes that Engström's story has changed with regard to many details. It seems that he has exaggerated his own role at the crime scene and has tried to give the impression that he has played an important role in the attempts to save Olof Palme's life and to help the police catch the murder. The panel considers this to be one of the probable reasons for the alterations of his story. Moreover, according to studies in witness psychology, it's common and natural for stories to change over time, and this should not be considered as an indication of an untruthful story. Regarding the specifics of the changes in Engström's story, the panel refers to the closing arguments of the defense. It's true that Engström does not seem to appear in the testimony of any witness present at the crime scene, including Lisbeth Palme. The panel does not consider this to prove that Engström was not present. Engström was a man of medium height, 122 centimeter, medium build, with no special facial features, wearing a 3/4 long dark winter coat on a cold night in Stockholm. He was very nondescript. Unless specifically asked about him, which the eyewitness were not, it's understandable that they do not remember him. To say in another language, they were not asked about him. The prosecution argues that Engström must have left the crime scene passing through Tunnelgatan, because otherwise he could not have actually described the blue gilded jacket and curly hair of Lars Jepsen. Jepsen had been hiding behind the porter cabins and was not visible from the murder scene. However, this is contradicted by the testimony of Lisbeth Palme, who states having seen a man in a dark blue gilded jacket at the corner of Tunnelgatan. She could have seen Jepsen, who was wearing a blue gilded jacket, which indicates that Jepsen was visible from the crime scene also for Engström. Or there was another man wearing a dark gilded jacket, potentially the murder. Jepsen himself describes the man he saw running up Tunnelgatan as wearing a dark gilded jacket. That exonerates Engström, who was not wearing a gilded jacket on the night of the murder. Engström's story contains some details which are in contradiction with some other witnesses, especially from testimonies of Anna Hagen and Stefan Glantz. However, this does not mean that Engström's story is not true. Hagen and Glantz were both busy trying to save the life of Olof Palme and mainly concentrated on that task, obviously not paying attention to the identity of people around them. Hage explicitly testified that when she was helping Palme, there was just a bus of people, and that someone started to pull all of Palme's legs, and amongst others that she asked that person, "What are you doing?" Because I was so involved in my work, but I only looked at the arms like, "What are you doing?" And then I carried on. It's therefore very problematic that they did not, it's therefore very probable that they did not pay any attention to Engström. Some of the discrepancies can also be explained by the fact that Engström exaggerated his own part in the events. So, after evaluating Engström's story and how it has changed in relation to the testimonies of other witnesses, the panel concludes that though the prosecution is right that Engström's story raised many questions, they don't support the prosecution's arguments sufficiently.
Thank you. About motive, the panel observes Engström was a member of the Conservative Party. According to the prosecution, there was a strong hostility towards Olof Palme in conservative circles in the 1980s. The prosecution has argued that this constitutes a motive for the murder. The panel considers that a membership in a non-extremist political party is not sufficient to establish a motive for the murder.
To the murder weapon. The murder weapon has not been found, but the bullet that killed Olof Palme has been identified as a .37 Magnum. This kind of bullet is typically used with a Magnum revolver manufactured by Smith & Wesson, but there are also other handguns that can be used to fire this kind of bullet. According to the prosecution, one of Engström's closest friends, Willy Glaser, collected firearms and owned a Smith & Wesson Magnum revolver. Forensic experts examined Glaser's Magnum and were unable to exclude that it was the murder weapon. Engström visited Glaser frequently, and it is therefore possible that Engström used Glaser's Magnum to commit the murder. The prosecution has also argued that Engström was a member of a shooting club and had experience with handguns. The panel notes that there is no evidence that Palme was shot with Glaser's Magnum revolver, nor is there evidence that Engström ever used any of Glaser's weapons. The prosecution's theory is mere speculation. Moreover, Glaser's Smith & Wesson Magnum is a very large revolver with an overall length of 29 centimeters, which is difficult to conceal and does not fit into Engström's wristlet bag, which undermines this theory. The panel concludes that the fact that Engström's friend Glaser owned a Magnum revolver has no probative value in this case.
Engström's character was not put forward as an argument both by the public prosecutor and the defense, but it's in the written file and it's also in this written verdict. Engström's character. According to the prosecution, Engström fits the criminal profile of the assassin of Palme created in 1994. Engström has professional setbacks as he had been passed over several times for promotion at Skandia. Engström had an inferiority complex and a narcissistic personality, which is evident from his interviews in the newspapers and television appearances. The panel notes that there is no record of Engström ever using violence. It is true that some of Engström's traits fit the criminal profile created in 1994. However, some other characteristics don't fit Engström. The panel concludes that Engström's character does not support a finding of guilt.
And now to the conclusion of the panel. There is no forensic or other physical evidence linking Engström to the murder. There is no evidence that sufficiently supports Engström's guilt. There are some rather weak indications that Engström could possibly have been the murderer, but there is no concrete evidence. Even If all these faint indications of Engström's guilt are combined, this is not enough to form even a strong suspicion against Engström. In conclusion, the panel finds that the evidence required for Stig Engström's conviction has not been established. There remains reasonable doubt about his guilt, and therefore the panel, by unanimous decision, finds him not guilty. Thank you.